The sun was sinking low over the dusty plains, painting the horizon in streaks of red and gold. Jed Carter wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned on the rail of his corral, watching his herd graze. Life out here was hard, but predictable, and Jed liked it that way. That is, until the drifter appeared. He came out of nowhere, a tall figure in a tattered coat, boots caked with dirt, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. Jed squinted. "Evenin'," he called, voice cautious but friendly. The drifter didn't answer, only stood there, silent, as if sizing him up. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel. Don't do it, Jed." Jed laughed nervously. "Do what? You got the wrong man, stranger. I ain't planning anything foolish." The drifter tilted his head, a grim shadow passing over his face. "You think you're clever. You think you know what's best. You don't. Not this time." He turned and started down the trail, his footsteps leaving no mark on the dry soil. "Mark my words, Jed. Don't do it." Jed frowned, his stomach tightening with unease. "Hey, wait," he shouted, but the man had vanished over the rise. Shaking his head, Jed muttered, "Crazy old coot," and returned to the herd. That night, sleep came fitfully. Shadows in the corners of his cabin seemed to twitch, and in his dreams he wandered a canyon rim, hearing that same whisper, don't do it." But when he awoke, the morning sun streamed through the window and all was calm. The cows were content, the wind was still, and the land seemed innocent again. Still, a seed of doubt had been planted. Jed tried to brush it off, telling himself it was nothing but a stranger's superstition. Yet, for the first time in years, the plains felt a little less familiar, a little less safe, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, just over the next hill, that he wasn't supposed to find. The morning sun beat down on the ranch, hot enough to make the dust rise in lazy swirls from the dirt road. Jed Carter was mending a broken fence post when he spotted a cloud of dust in the distance. Curious, he shaded his eyes with a calloused hand. A wagon rattled down the trail, carrying a stranger with a wide-brimmed hat, a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, and a box full of trinkets clinking in the back. The man hitched his horse outside Jed's corral and tipped his hat. "Mornin', sir. Name's Silas Reed. I bring news, and opportunities, if you've got a mind for 'em." He bounced on his heels, reaching into the wagon and pulling out a rolled-up map. The paper shimmered oddly in the sunlight, the edges curling like it had been buried in soil for years. "Found something mighty fine, just beyond the canyon yonder. Silver. Rich silver. Enough to set you up for life." Jed's brow furrowed. Memories of the drifter's warning whispered through his mind. Don't do it." He shook his head. "I've got enough to keep me busy right here. Don't need riches chasing me into trouble." Silas laughed, loud and hollow. "Trouble? Bah, trouble's for men who never take a chance. You, Jed Carter, are a man who works hard. You deserve this. Just follow the map, stake your claim, and, well, I won't say it'll be easy, but fortune favors the bold, eh." He winked and rolled the map in Jed's hands. The paper felt warmer than it should, almost alive, and Jed's fingers itched to unroll it fully, to trace the silver veins promised there. Jed felt the tension in his chest, the pull of something bigger than cattle or fences. The drifter's warning rang again, sharper this time. Don't do it." He clenched his jaw. I'll think about it," he said, trying to sound casual. Silas's grin widened. "That's all I ask, sir. But the land waits for no one." With a tip of his hat, the salesman climbed into his wagon and disappeared down the trail as quickly as he had come. Jed stood in silence, the map heavy in his hand. The wind stirred the prairie grass, and for a moment, it seemed to whisper the same caution the drifter had. Don't do it." But Jed's eyes, bright with a mixture of curiosity and stubborn pride, scanned the horizon beyond the canyon. The lure of silver was intoxicating, a temptation too strong for a man like him to ignore. By dawn, Jed had saddled his horse. He told himself he was only checking it out, that he'd turn back if it seemed dangerous. Yet deep down, he knew the moment he crossed that canyon's edge, there would be no turning back, and that the warning he'd ignored might have been the only thing keeping him safe. The canyon was a different world, carved from rock and shadow, the walls towering like silent sentinels. Jed guided his horse carefully along the narrow trail, every step sending loose stones clattering down into the abyss below. The air was hotter here, thicker, and every gust of wind carried an unsettling echo, as if the canyon itself was whispering warnings he couldn't quite hear. He unrolled the map, the silver veins sketched in faded ink glinting under the sun. Just a little further, he muttered to himself, voice tight with anticipation. His horse snorted nervously, pawing at the ground as if sensing the danger Jed refused to acknowledge. The first glimpse of silver struck him like a revelation. Jagged rocks caught the sunlight, and glimmers of metal peeking from the cliffs made his heart race. He swung down from his saddle, tools in hand, and began to dig. The earth was dry, crumbling in his fingers, but he ignored it. One more shovel, one more scoop, and the promise of wealth would be his. That's when the warning crept back, louder than ever in his mind. Don't do it. Jed shook his head, trying to dismiss it as fear. He had worked hard all his life, he deserved this. But the canyon had its own plans. A sharp crack echoed through the walls as the ground beneath his boots shifted. Jed froze, heart hammering. A small ledge of rock gave way, sliding into the chasm below. He leapt back instinctively, only to realize the soil he had been standing on was unstable, sinking, as if the canyon itself was swallowing him. He scrambled backward, heart in his throat, and narrowly avoided a plunge that would have ended him instantly. Dust filled the air, clinging to sweat on his skin, and for the first time, Jed felt real fear. The map slipped from his hands, tumbling into the canyon, and with it went his hope of easy silver. Shaken, he sank to his knees, staring at the jagged rocks and the abyss just a few feet away. The canyon seemed to mock him, silent and unforgiving, as the wind carried a faint echo. Don't do it. Jed's pride wrestled with the truth. He had ignored the warning, and fortune had almost cost him everything. Hours passed before he finally rode back toward the ranch, empty-handed and shaken. The silver was gone, the map lost, and something heavier had settled on his chest, the realization that some temptations were not meant to be chased, no matter how desperate or determined a man might be. By the time the sun dipped below the canyon rim, casting long shadows over the plains, Jed Carter felt a gnawing unease. He had survived, yes, but the price of his stubbornness was already beginning to make itself known. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The days after Jed's canyon misadventure passed uneventfully at first, but a creeping unease began to settle over the ranch. The wind seemed sharper, carrying an almost whispered warning through the tall prairie grass. The cows, usually content and steady, had grown restless, pacing in tight circles and lowing in tones that sent shivers down Jed's spine. It started with the tools. The hammer he used to mend fences split in half for no reason, the wagon wheel cracked as though it had been rotten for years, and the plow bent like soft metal under the lightest pressure. Each accident was small, almost dismissible, but together, they began to gnaw at Jed's confidence. Then the crops. One morning, he stepped into the field to find the wheat yellowed and brittle, the corn curling under some invisible blight. He cursed under his breath, bending over to touch the soil. It felt wrong, parched, almost hot beneath his fingers, as if it had been poisoned overnight. Even the townsfolk noticed. Neighbors came by with sideways glances and whispers that cut deeper than any insult. "Your ranch, it's cursed, Jed," one old-timer muttered, tipping his hat nervously. "Saw the same thing once, back when I was young. Land like that, it don't forgive." Jed's pride flared, but worry gnawed at him. He tried to mend what he could, repairing fences, tending to the sickly herd, praying quietly under the porch roof, but the more he struggled, the worse it seemed. Every repair broke, every prayer felt ignored, and the herd seemed sicker than before. One night, he swore he saw shadowy figures moving along the edge of the fields, figures that vanished when he blinked. The whisper followed him even inside his cabin, faint but unmistakable. Don't do it." Jed clenched his jaw, leaning heavily on the railing of his porch. He had survived the canyon, yes, but he could feel the weight of something he had awakened, a reckoning for his stubbornness and greed. The land itself seemed alive, responding to the choices he had made, punishing him in ways he could barely understand. For the first time in his life, Jed Carter felt helpless, and the lesson the drifter had tried to give him now burned with painful clarity. Some warnings were not meant to be ignored. And some mistakes, no matter how small they seemed at first, had consequences that refused to be undone. The sky over the ranch had turned a deep, bruised gray, heavy clouds rolling in like a warning of their own. Jed Carter sat on the worn wooden porch, boots dusty and hands raw from endless labor, staring across the fields that had once been his pride. Now the grass was patchy, the crops twisted and dead, and the herd, though mostly still alive, moved with a dull, listless energy that chilled him to the bone. Lightning split the horizon, illuminating the canyon he had dared to cross. The memory of loose rock and the near plunge flashed across his mind, and for the first time, fear wasn't a fleeting thing, it was a living, gnawing presence. The whisper returned, clearer than ever, curling in his ears. Don't do it. He muttered the words himself, shaking his head. I shouldn't have done it, he admitted aloud, the weight of his stubbornness pressing on him like the heavy storm above. He thought of the drifter, of the map, of the canyon, and of every small misstep that had led to this ruin. It wasn't just bad luck. It was consequence, born from pride and greed. The storm broke suddenly, rain pounding the tin roof, turning the dry earth into slick mud. Thunder rolled through the canyon like a great drum of judgment. Jed watched as lightning struck the cliffside near the canyon's edge, sending a shower of sparks and a small rock slide tumbling down. It was a stark reminder that the land itself had not forgotten, had not forgiven. And then came the sound of hooves on the trail. Another traveler appeared, riding hard, hat tipped low, carrying a fresh map tucked under his arm. Jed's heart sank. The same temptation he had fallen for was being offered again. But this time, he shook his head, his eyes hollow but resolute. Don't do it, he muttered to the man. The traveler paused, uncertain, before nodding and riding on, leaving Jed alone in the rain and wind. Jed remained on the porch long after the visitor had gone, soaked and shivering. The storm raged around him, but the lesson had settled deep into his bones. He had survived the canyon, he had survived the curse, but the cost was etched into the land, the herd, and himself. Some warnings were not meant to be ignored. Some choices carried consequences that would linger long after the temptation was gone. And so Jed Carter sat, listening to the thunder and the whispering wind, knowing he had lived to regret, but also knowing he had finally learned the hard way that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed without leaving scars.